Welcome, everybody, to another exciting episode of Archaeology After Dark. I'm your host, Daniel Rose, and I'm really excited about this episode because it is the first one that is crossing into a different time zone. My guest this week is Jacob Steere Williams. Jacob, thanks for being here.
Hey, nice to see you, Daniel.
So, our topic this week is epidemic diseases, pandemic diseases. The reason I wanted to talk about this is, of course, because of COVID-19, but the United States has a long history of pandemic and epidemic diseases. And the reason that that connects to archaeology is because we not only study, the material culture, but the immaterial culture, things that change the way people behave, act, and how they proceed going into the future, just like we do now. We've had make a lot of changes, quarantining, social distancing, and we've got a long history of that in America. So, Jacob, having said that, where would you like to start as far as epidemic diseases go?
Yeah, it's a really good introduction there, Daniel. Thank you very much. So, it's one of the interesting things about American history and global history as well, is that we, in the last, you might say, a couple hundred years in American history, we've done a really good job of remembering certain things. So, I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a professor at the College of Charleston, and we are, one of the cities in America that is very visibly into public history and the kind of things that we remember about the Revolutionary War, about the Civil War, about slavery. And yet, you look around the landscape in America, and there's very few remembrance about epidemics and pandemics. And that's something that, as a historian of public health and a historian about epidemics, that I've always been really fascinated with. And if you think about the way in which public history, the recent kind of politicization of memorials in this country has really become such an important issue. And there seems to be this real vacuum in this country for how we think about, how we remember, and how we engage with epidemics. And that's really interesting to me because, as we're experiencing right now in the middle of our own, generation defining pandemic of COVID-19, it's going to be hard, I think, for us to talk about the early 2000s without talking about COVID-19. And yet, if you think back in American history, that's almost always been true. So if you look at the early period of American history, we were a country that was breaking away from Great Britain, trying to establish our own system of governance while we were dealing with repeated outbreaks of yellow fever and smallpox. In the 19th century, we were a country that was dealing with outbreaks of industrial waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid fever, a book that I just, have a topic that I just have a book that's come out on. And in the 20th century, we were a country that dealt with repeated blows of outbreaks from the Spanish influenza that a lot of folks will be familiar with, and we might want to talk a little bit about that here today, throughout the 20th century. So it's kind of interesting if we just take a long historical frame and we might come to the conclusion, and this is something I talk a lot about in my classes, that we have always dealt with pandemics. And pandemics have always found a way to define generations in this country. And yet there's a real historical question that I think we all should be asking right now, is why is it that we've tended to forget the epidemic experience in this country?
Well, why do you think that is? Is it just, people, they found a cure for the disease like yellow fever, people just write it off as soon as we find a cure for it?
Yeah, I think I think that's an interesting point. Often, in our experience of dealing with epidemic disease over long periods of historical time, it's often not that we find a cure for those diseases, but that those diseases end up either going away through natural evolutionary kinds of means. And we actually have some really good models for this. So, some of my colleagues who work in the field of evolutionary biology, what they've shown is that over long periods of human history, and you can take that real long biological perspective through things like sequencing the genomes of particular microorganisms, what we've shown is that when mutations happen in the natural world, which for microorganisms are always happening, that when a new mutation happens, just like we're experiencing right now with COVID-19, that those mutations lead to a high level of virulence in affecting human populations that don't have immunity towards them. But over time, sometimes that takes a few years, sometimes that takes decades, that most infectious diseases that are caused by mutations, they end up lowering their levels of virulence through things like host immunity, through environmental changes, et cetera, et cetera. And what that means is that sometimes epidemics just become endemic diseases, right? And other times, you're right, we do find cures for them. And so what this all adds up to, I think, is this process of what I always like to talk about is disremembering rather than remembering, becomes this process of us just becoming used to the rhythms of infectious diseases. You know, and the example that I always, like to talk about in even recent history with most undergraduates, an average undergraduate student that's, 18 to 22 years old, when I talk to them and teach them and introduce them to the HIV AIDS epidemic that happened in the early 1980s, that's very recent history. And yet it's almost something that's already been forgotten.
Is it, well, I know the HIV AIDS epidemic was a big part of the way we approached how to deal with politics in Africa. Was it the same thing here in the United States, or was it just completely different because it was on the other side of the world?
Yeah, no, there's an interesting story with HIV AIDS, right, in the early 1980s, to where it's a disease. The LA Times has a headline that calls it the gay plague in the early 1980s. And even, the early epidemiologists that studied HIV AIDS targeted gay people, specifically gay men, and more specifically gay African American men, for spreading this disease. And there's this way in which in the US, for the first decade of that outbreak, AIDS is seen as something that is its roots, its origins, its sort of origin story is one that's of blame and stigmatization. And it's only into the 1990s and the early 2000s that the discourse on HIV/AIDS changes from a gay disease to what we see now, where most of the students that I teach, that when I introduce the story about HIV/AIDS and its recent history, they don't link it to being a quote unquote stigmatized gay disease. They locate it as a disease of the other, a disease of the interior of Africa. And that's a discourse that's changed in this country, to where we found a sort of way to disremember the early history of HIV/AIDS in favor of this other global story to shift the blame. And that's something that, I think if we wanted to try to draw some historical parallels, some real long parallels of how we have tended to deal with epidemics in the past in this country, it ultimately, to start with, is a kind of narrative of blaming, or of what the noted historian Charles Rosenberg called naming and blaming. And so you can look at 18th century yellow fever, where colonial Americans in that period blamed, in the late 18th century, there's a massive series of outbreaks of yellow fever that they hit Philadelphia, they hit Charleston, they hit Wilmington, they hit New Orleans, big port cities. And often that's blamed on this big political crisis that's happening in the Atlantic world at that time, of the Haitian Revolution. So it's blamed on that natural disaster that's politically happening with a slave revolt. You look at the 19th century in cholera, and when cholera first arrives on American shores in 1831 and 1832, it's blamed on the East. It's even called Asian cholera or Indian cholera or Asiatic cholera. The same thing happens in 1900, when bubonic plague sweeps across the world in what's called the third plague pandemic, That's the topic of my current book that I'm working on right now. And all throughout the world and in the US, when that pandemic hits, a bubonic plague, it's once again seen as this natural disaster that comes from somewhere else. And in this case, it's seen as coming from Asia. And so we found a way to blame other people for pandemics in this country. And that's really interesting. That's something that historians have long pointed out, but it's something that I think to keep in mind, particularly if we try to frame the early history of COVID-19 and think about how our own pandemic was framed as we see even the current president early in this pandemic called it the Chinese plague.
It's interesting that you bring up the bubonic plague because that's something everybody learns in a European history class, a world history class, how it wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population in a relatively short amount of time, but no one ever talks about a second or third wave of it ever even happening.
Yeah, that's right. And this has become, I think, a kind of niche academic subject, but one that is gaining more interest and popularity, and especially in our own time of thinking about pandemics and epidemic disease. Is we have experienced a whole handful of pandemics that have really been forgotten. And that one of the bubonic plague, what's called the third plague pandemic that did originate, historical epidemiologists do tell us, out of China in the late 19th century, in the 1890s. And it swept across the globe, killing millions of people. Now, most of those deaths were located in India and in China and in Africa, but there were some real hotspots in the U.S. as well. The one that comes to mind that that has been studied by scholars is in San Francisco. This is right around the time where immigration is such a big issue in America, and there's a lot of nativism and xenophobia. And right at that same time, on ports like Ellis Island on the East Coast and Angel Island on the West Coast, there's this explosion of bubonic plague. And the public health authorities at the time in America, they're armed with what is seen at that time in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century as the most cutting edge science that they have ever known of the germ theory and of bacteriology and epidemiology. And what's interesting about that time period, and it's one that I think is probably one of the most fascinating in American history and in world global history, is the scientists did first start to get it right, and quote unquote right. They started to understand infectious disease, at least those infectious diseases that are caused by bacteria. For the first time, they started to get that science right, understanding that certain infectious diseases are singular things. They're external to human bodies. They're not just caused by bad smells rotting from the atmosphere, miasmas, and they're caused by microorganisms. And yet, even as that science started to get it right and be on the right track, the practices of public health, we might call the germ practices, not the germ theory, were ones that were about blaming and stigmatization and uneven distribution of those practices. And so just to give you a couple examples here, because this is something I'm working on for this book right now that I'm working on, is in the early 20th century, during the bubonic plague pandemic and during repeated outbreaks of other infectious diseases, U.S. public health officials that were part of the U.S. Public Health Service and two, part of local public health offices and state public health offices, they routinely at port cities and along the southern border of the US, from California all the way to Texas, routinely stopped immigrants from coming into this country, which we all are sort of tacitly familiar with, right? But what we don't often know is that those immigrants were stopped, they were medically inspected, and many, many times, thousands and thousands of cases, they were stripped naked and disinfected with chemical disinfectants, sprayed carbolic acid or a corrosive supplement on their bodies. It is a completely forgotten, whitewashed, we might even say, part of American history.
Well, we have a track record of how we teach American history now. Like these are things that people don't really teach in American history classes.
Yeah, that's right. And you're in Alabama. One of the things that always amazes me is in the second part of my history of medicine and disease class, as you might imagine, I talk about and I share stories and primary sources and secondary sources about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments from the 1930s until the 1970s, where the U.S. Public Health Service they experimented on a group of African American men who had syphilis and deliberately withheld treatment even after the discovery of penicillin in the 1940s and the widespread availability of penicillin after World War II to the civilian population, just to solely study the effects of syphilis on the human body. And that experiment that was run by the US government was one that is just one example, but it's probably the most infamous example, and it's one that students don't know about today.
Well, like I said, this isn't a subject that we normally cover in American history. We hear about a disease like the Spanish flu pandemic, things like that, happening in the early 1900s, and then it gets cured and then it just goes away. People just forget that it happened.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've been working really hard on in the last couple years, and especially the last year during our own COVID-19 pandemic, is to try to fuse and bring together the history of disease and medicine and public health with public history. And I think we're at this really interesting moment in the historical profession, and I think more broadly in this country of thinking about and using and trying to reckon with our country's past and do that using public history. And I think that there's a real moment right now with our own pandemic to try to come to grips with our nation's experience with pandemic disease.
So I know, at the time these diseases were occurring, the healthcare system isn't or wasn't what it is now. How did they go about solving these problems with what they had?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, it sort of depends on, as you might imagine, it depends on the context and on the time. And, and it's easy to fall into the argument, which I think is a really important argument. It's one that I usually always start with in teaching this material and thinking through it, is that we have to understand that epidemic diseases, they never happen in a vacuum. It's not just their biology and their epidemiology, the way that they're spread and how they affect a community, but rather that they exist in a cultural milieu, in a social context. And so, we can look repeatedly across American history and see the way in which health inequalities impact those who get struck more voraciously by any given pandemic. And we can see that, today during our own pandemic as well. I'll give you an example of that. So one of the things that I've been studying since COVID broke out is the experience of Charleston, the city that I live in, and its medical history and history of dealing with pandemic disease. And you take what was probably our most prolific experience of a pandemic in history of 1918, 1919 influenza. And as I started looking into our local archives, I noticed that, Charleston was a city in the late 19th, early 20th century that was predominantly African American. And it was a city that also it boasted the first and the finest medical school in the South at that time, the Medical University of South Carolina. It had advanced hospitals for that period in American history. And yet, during the outbreak of influenza in 1918 and early 1919, African Americans died at home. And African Americans, by and large, were not receiving medical care. That has been interesting to me to think through the kind of historical reasons and the way in which race and gender and ethnicity and class inflect upon pandemics at any given time. And so it's something that I think, as we talk about and think about how communities deal with pandemics, we have to always remember and think about the contemporary context with which health inequalities tempered the way in which communities experienced pandemics. And so we do see time and time again throughout American history, stories. And often this is where historians used to start, and they would forget about the health inequalities in the social context. We see real, improvements, as much as pandemics are opportunities and epidemic diseases are opportunities for us to grapple with the worst parts of our humanity, our blaming and our stigmatization. They've also been opportunities for scientists to grapple with fundamental biological scientific problems, for scientists to improve medical knowledge. And so you do see that part as well. Repeated outbreaks of cholera in the 19th century, this just really devastating infectious disease. It's a waterborne disease. You see in the second half of the 19th century, the first systems of public health emerge in this country. You see real positive kinds of change. You see after the 1918-1919 influenza outbreak, at that time, scientists believed that flu was caused by a bacteria. We know today that it's caused by a virus, right? But at that time, it was believed to be a bacteria. And it was only after the failures of a pandemic like that and dealing with it that scientists first started to explore new avenues of research with virology. So the field of virology, in some ways, has its genesis, I think, through experiencing this horrific pandemic disease. So there's the kind of silver linings and the kind of ugly parts that I think are just inexorably tied to any pandemic, including our own.
So you're talking about the study of virology. That, would you say this is where, medical science really started to take off as far as, growing to what it is now?
Yeah, probably it started in the late 19th century with the explosion of bacteriology. And, bacteriology, it's interesting. We look at some of the famous figures in bacteriology, some of the, Europeans in particular, people like Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. And we think like, aha, here's this moment when scientists first started to get disease, right, quote unquote. And then you start to see by the early 20th century, all of the failings of the field of bacteriology, because so many infectious diseases are not caused by bacteria, they're caused by viruses. So you're right that by the 1930s, with the development of the electron microscope and the first real knowledge of viruses, which had been tacitly sort of understood from around 1900, but not fully developed into any kind of science until the 1930s, you see that come together right at this really fascinating period in the interwar period in America, where you have, the modern synthesis happening in biology, and you have, the new research on cancer happening and nuclear transplantation, and a real explosion of what I think many people would call, modern contemporary, 20th century science happening in the interwar years.
So with all these changes happening, how would it affect like the day-to-day life of a person who's been affected by one of these diseases?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one that actually has long, I think puzzled is the right word, but it's still an ongoing controversy. And so if you look at long periods of human history, and really if you look at all of American history, to put it in a more specific, succinct way, what you see are some pretty major stark demographic changes. And so up until around 1900, what we saw demographically in the US and in Western Europe as well is a demographic pattern where, yes, Langston, sorry, my son's asking a lot of good questions too. A demographic pattern whereby you had low levels of life expectancy, you had high birth rates and high death rates. And that was being driven by high rates of infectious disease, high rates of maternal and infant mortality. the industrial diseases of the 19th century: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, all of these very common diseases which could strike anyone and take anyone's life very easily and very quickly. Around 1900 and about until World War I, those major infectious diseases started to decline and go away, to the extent that by the interwar years and by the end of World War II, the leading causes of death in America are heart disease, cancer, and accidents. They're chronic diseases. And that demographic change is extremely fascinating because we don't really know why it happened. And this gets back to your question because, the first real wonder drug in solving the riddle of infectious diseases to everyday people, something that we all just inherently know with, accept, and even want today, is the first example was penicillin. Something that you can be sick, you can go to a doctor, they can give you a drug or an injection, and you can be cured. That is an entirely recent new historical phenomenon. And what's fascinating is all those major infectious diseases, they declined before we had a therapy for them.
So would you say it's just, people naturally adapting to the environment of the disease, or is it just us as people adapting to it?
Yeah, so part of it is recognition. I think part of it, and I think it's a couple different, parts of this equation. And I think it holds enormous significance for world, global demographic history and for American history in particular, is part of that story of why those infectious diseases declined in the early 20th century is because we first started to recognize the epidemiological pathways of the major infectious diseases. So recognizing that cholera and typhoid fever, for example, and the salmonellas are spread through contaminated food and water. Well, you don't need a drug to solve those problems. What you need is a public health infrastructure. You need pure water and you need a sewage system, right? And so there was investment for the first time from local, state, and federal governments to construct and to abide by municipal sanitation, something that we all just take for granted today, that you can turn on your tap water and you can drink water that's safe. For most of the vast majority of American history and world history, that just was not a guarantee. And so part of it was an investment in public health. The other part of it was recognizing that we all have a responsibility, an individual responsibility with our community health. And this is something that we're dealing with COVID-19 right now. I think it's one of the key issues with COVID-19, actually. And it's one that's not new. And what I mean to say is, part of the solution to solving any infectious disease is realizing that we all as individuals play an important role in serving as little nodules in this epidemiological map of how a disease can spread. And we all play an important role in not spreading an infectious disease. And that's something that in the early 20th century, this period of massive demographic change, of industrialization and urbanization and immigration, is we see public health authorities for the first time doing massive amounts of what we now would call health promotion or health education or health communication. They traveled around doing stump speeches. They went on the radio. Later in the 20th century, they went on television. They handed out, they went to schools. They went to community meetings. There was this real grassroots public health communication that was part of that historical process. And it was something that, by and large, I think Americans bought into. This belief that we all have a small role to play in stopping something that is beyond politics, something that is beyond even our borders. It's geopolitical, right? I mean, infectious diseases don't know political boundaries. And yet, it's something that is now coming full circle with COVID-19 to where, wearing a mask for many people has become this galvanizing political issue about rights and someone's individual rights, when in fact, I think that has nothing to do with it. It's about protecting our community.
So you were talking about, health standards improving and things like that in the early 1900s. I know one thing we talk about in a lot of American history classes is creation of organizations like the FDA and things like that who regulate and make sure the food we consume is healthy. So would the creation of something like the FDA have played a part in reducing things like salmonella and things along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the actually it started in the late 19th century with food adulteration and the widespread recognition that many of the most basic foods that we consume were adulterated in that period. Some of my doctoral work actually looked at the chemistry of food adulteration in the 19th century. And it's pretty interesting to see how individual chemists looking at that food adulteration translated into national legislation throughout Western Europe and North America. And you're certainly right that that played a role in the decline of many infectious diseases. But it was part of this larger infrastructure. And what's interesting, is, if you compare the US to other countries in Western Europe or across the world, what you see is that we have a very, by and large, a decentralized political structure for dealing with infectious diseases. And we saw this with COVID. We saw, the national political infrastructure delegating the COVID response to individual states. That is not very common in the world today, in most other countries. And what's interesting about that is there is this belief, and I think it's fairly uniquely American, that we can and should solve problems, even big problems like natural disasters, at a very local, state-based level. It's entrenched in our kind of political ideology in this country. And one of the things I think we can see is that big natural disasters like pandemics, they require real centralization to solve. And that's uncomfortable for many Americans to realize, that there are states that the countries rather, that many Americans believe that their system of centralized governance is wrong or is immoral or is authoritarian, that have dealt with past pandemics and have dealt with the current pandemic in a much more effective way. And yet, what's so ironic to me about that as a historian of this topic is that we have built an infrastructure in this country that actually is equipped to deal with pandemics at a national level. We have so many federal kinds of responses, research centers that could be unified to deal with something like a pandemic. And yet our political ethos is so stuck on the state level that we just haven't put it together.
I know organizations like the Center for Disease Control have played a huge role in, I don't want to say controlling pandemics, but they have played a huge role in reducing the frequency of them over at least my lifetime. I know that.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right, and I think like there's the potential there. What's also important to keep in mind is that we also have this real ugly history in this country of centralized public health institutions and authorities taking advantage of disenfranchised populations. So the Tuskegee syphilis study that I mentioned earlier, 1932 to 1972, was run by the U.S. Public Health Service. The U.S. Public Health Service was doing a similar study in Guatemala at that period, as historian Susan Reverby has examined. So, there's all sorts of kind of examples here that we have to brace and balance with trying to see public health as a kind of national good, and public health as something that is a potentially dangerous kind of centralization of authority.
So you teach this material to college students, and at the end of the semester, what is something you want them to get out of studying this as a subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. My takeaway message before COVID, and I had this
Yeah, there's this, before COVID message, which is great. You get to actually see them in person and convey the message to them. Now you have to, record this and just hope they get the point.
talk to a blank screen. Yeah, so my message before COVID, my last lecture in person was always, we have just spent 14 weeks studying the history of pandemics in America and in Western Europe, in the world, really. What you have seen is a different way to think about history, think about our history in this country. And what I hope that you've gotten out of that history is that disease is not always just biological. It's not just that disease is a bacteria or a virus that invades our body, something you can get in middle school biology class. That disease is much more than that. Disease is yes, a biological component, but it's always a social component and a cultural component. That the way that we name a disease is important. Calling a disease Asiatic cholera or Indian cholera mattered to the way people thought about it. That the way that we experience disease is unique to our time and our place. And that the way that we respond to disease depends on our politics. It depends on our cultural ideologies of the time. And so what I always try to tell students is we can see those things in the past much easier because of the value of a historical perspective than we can in our own lifetimes. But I always tell students this is before COVID, at some point in your lifetime, you will experience a big pandemic disease. You just will. I've just been telling students this for 15 years. We will see this. Human epidemic disease is an inexorable part of our human history. You can't describe any era of American history without talking about a pandemic or an epidemic disease. You can ignore them, but they're there. And now all of a sudden, we're faced with this reality. And I think it's a kind of important crossroads, not just in our country and the direction of our country, but for how we use and think about history and the value of history. I actually I have a final exam assignment for my students this semester in my class, and I asked them very simply just to tell me what is the value of thinking through past pandemics that can help us today going forward. So something real life, practical value of history, not an academic kind of use of history, but a real practical use of history. And that's something that I think is tremendously important right now. Because I do worry, I really do, looking at past pandemics, that you and I, as people who lived through COVID-19, anybody who's gonna watch this video, we're not gonna forget about COVID-19. But if we don't actively remember it and impart a kind of historical memory of COVID-19, then it will be forgotten. It'll be forgotten, just like the Spanish influenza and yellow fever and smallpox and bubonic plague. Those are the past.
So when you're teaching your class and they're learning about this subject, can they, while they're studying the material, can they actively see how society adjusted or compensated to the pandemic?
Yeah, that's definitely part of, any historical exploration of a pandemic is seeing, how did people respond at the time? How did scientists respond? How did lay people respond? How did lawmakers respond? And you get to see the real on the ground changes that did happen as a pandemic or an epidemic approaches and starts, as it's in the middle, and then after it ends. And so, yeah, you're right that is a kind of process. One historian has described epidemics as a kind of play, right? So there's a kind of dramaturgical effect to epidemics, that they start in a particular time, they have a plot line, they reach a climax, and then they end. And that's interesting. I think it's a provocative kind of analogy for thinking about epidemics, but it's also one that I think kind of ignores the way in which many infectious diseases. And, this book that I wrote, it just came out on typhoid fever, is a good example of that, to where some diseases continue to inflict our populations and we just forget about them. So, typhoid is a disease that in the 18th century, the 19th century, and until about the 1940s and the 1950s, was one of the major killers and diseases in Western Europe and North America. And once there was an effective public health response to that disease of safeguarding food and water supplies, it became a disease that was just forgotten, in spite of the fact that worldwide typhoid is one of the major killers of children around the world. So we've forgotten about the disease, but it doesn't mean that the disease is gone. And I do worry about that with COVID-19 too. So I can imagine a scenario, just to run this out. I've been thinking through this quite a lot lately. There's a lot of talk in the last couple of weeks about a COVID-19 vaccine, right? In order for a vaccine to eliminate COVID-19, it needs to be a worldwide vaccine. Can't just be a vaccine for wealthy industrialized countries. And the only example that we have of eradicating an infectious disease like this is with the global campaign to eradicate smallpox, which finally was completed in the 1980s. That's the only single example we have in world history. That took incredible, unprecedented, global kinds of networks, communication, collaboration. And I haven't seen anyone yet talk about a full global collaborative effort to tackle COVID-19. I just haven't seen it. We haven't seen it in this country. We've been focused on us. We've been focused on, even more than us, we've been focused on our own states, our own local communities. And that's a very American way of thinking about pandemics, is thinking about them just as your local kind of experience. But COVID-19 is a worldwide phenomenon, as I think everybody knows that, but they forget that very quickly. And unless we come up with a global solution, then I fear that COVID-19 is just going to become a disease of the global South, just like many other infectious diseases have become.
So when people who were alive at the time during the Spanish influenza, yellow fever, when those pandemics finally ended, do you think the people were actually changed because of it?
Yeah, I do. I think that the people that lived through and experienced those infectious diseases, those pandemics, certainly were changed. There's a really great book on the 1918-1919 influenza that's written by a historian. Her name is Nancy Bristow, and in her book, she talks about the process by which Americans publicly forgot about the Spanish flu, but privately in their families, in their family sort of histories, in their family oral histories, the way that they had pictures displayed on their mantelpieces, the way that they described and taught, children and grandchildren about, their relatives, they held on to a memory that was real and important and valuable of the Spanish flu. And so I think actually, without any cohesive national kind of response to COVID-19, I do wonder if that will be our experience too going forward. That, you and I will, when we're in our 80s, we'll be able to tell stories of COVID-19. But those stories will be the narratives that survive.
We'll have the memes to prove we were here.
Yeah, exactly. But what will inevitably happen, and I see this, teaching, and I mentioned the example of HIV AIDS, is, within a couple generations, so I have two young sons that are 5 and 3, will they remember COVID-19? Maybe not. So there's a way in which by the time, that a generation and a half happens, or 2 generations happen, if we don't actively memorialize pandemics and the pandemic response, it will just become something that dies with us in our memories. That's a really fascinating question that I'm very intrigued by, because it's one that in past pandemics it's almost played out like a broken record. That the people that lived through a pandemic, it was enormously important, and it changed in infrastructure and institutions. Sometimes it changed law and politics and religion, and yet it within a couple generations gets forgotten.
You actually bring up a really good point, and I just thought about this. Would a person, like a full-grown adult, remember a pandemic the same way a child would? You know, an adult has the world knowledge to realize what's actually going on. A child would just be told, "Oh, please don't do this, please don't do that," without actually realizing what's going on in the world.
Yeah, that's right. So, my two sons, they, at my university, we have a very small daycare center for pre kindergarten children, and so both my sons are in that program, and they wear masks all day long, from 9 o'clock until 2 o'clock. They're masked up unless they're eating, and they comply every single day. It's not hard for them. And that's a very small example, but it's also one that I have been trying to play out in my mind, because there is this way in which you're right that children do serve as a kind of proxy during any pandemic disease.
Oh, I have my first co-host. That's awesome.
You say hi?
Hi.
You wear masks at school, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. High five.
Except at lunchtime.
Except at lunchtime. You're right.
Well, that's because lunch is the most important thing of the day, but that's neither here nor there.
No, but that is interesting, because you're right that my son Langston is going to remember this very differently than you and I are going to remember this, and that's something that there's in teaching cholera and bubonic plague, for example, and influenza. All three of those examples in American history, the mid 19th century, around the turn of the century, and then in the early 20th century, all three of those examples, big pandemic experiences. What we see is little anecdotes of children making up little rhymes and little games. There's stories that you find in the newspapers that I found in American newspapers in the 1840s and the 1850s of children playing cholera, where they would have one kid that would lay down and fake to be dead, and then the other kids would cart him off.
Wow, that is morbid. I cannot say I ever learned that one in school.
Yeah, exactly. I think that just speaks to this very powerful way in which we remember, but like I started out, in our chat, we disremember pandemics too. And I think there's this way in which, pandemics are we all know this now. People that study this knew this before, but we all know it now. They're hard. They're hard on our communities. They're hard on our sense of identity. They're hard on our mental health and our physical health. And they're enormously important generation defining events. And when they're over, people want to go celebrate. And people want to forget. And I think that's what drives a lot of this, for this disremembering, is people want to forget. There's an example from Charleston, the city I live in this research that I've been doing on the Spanish influenza, where the fall of 1918, there's a spike in cases all around the U.S. Charleston's public health officer, he initiates stay-at-home orders, quarantine orders, and that gets followed for about a month. And after about a month, people just say, we're done. We're done staying at home. We got to get on with our lives. Businesses have to reopen. People have to start going to church again. And there's all this sort of political clamor about reopening the economy, reopening businesses. It sounds really, really familiar, right? Because this exact same thing happened in this country, COVID-19. And it also happens to be Armistice Day, end of World War I. People in Charleston flock to the center of the city, and they do this all around the country. and they hold these massive rallies and celebrations in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic.
That's not good.
And cases, as you might imagine, they go up and they spike again. And there's this real tension, I think, between what is a public health good. What should we do in a pandemic? What kind of public health advice should we listen to? And then all the other things that we want to do, whether that's about our personal lives, whether that's about our religious beliefs or our political beliefs. And I think, what we've seen with COVID-19 today is one that, as a historian of pandemics, it's one that it just keeps playing over and over and over again in American history. People said the same stuff in the fall of 1918 that they're saying now. That wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is my own individual liberty, that no one's going to tell me I have a stay-at-home order, that I'm going to open my business and run my business however damn well I please. The same things that we're hearing now were happening in 1918, 1919.
So say a history student, a biology student wants to learn more about the history of pandemic diseases. Where would you recommend they start?
What do they do? Sorry, I lost you there. You broke up a little bit.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. So say somebody wants to start learning about pandemics, the history of pandemics, the biology of it, how it affected people socially, economically. Where would you recommend they start?
Yeah, it's a good idea. It's a really good question. So, there's actually a pretty good literature on this subject. There's quite a few popular written books. One of the earliest couple were books by Alfred Crosby on the ecological imperialism and the Columbian Exchange. There's another early books written by people like Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, that many people will be familiar with. But for more of a serious academic study, I think where people might look at is there's a host of master's programs all throughout the country that focus on this topic. Where if you're an undergraduate student and you're interested and you're piqued by the study of epidemics and disease and pandemics, that you should reach out. I mean, I'd be happy to anybody that's listening and watching this, can email me directly, and I can rattle off in an email to you or a phone conversation, all the programs that the master's and then the PhD level, you can get real training in this topic. But it's one that's interesting too, because, I was somebody that as an undergrad, I thought I started out as a pre-med major. I was pre-med in biochemistry, and I wasn't dealing with history. I actually had, I grew up in a rural town, and I didn't have a very good experience with history teachers until I got to college. And so it wasn't until, I was pretty far along my college career thinking I would go into medicine and go into medical science that I actually learned that I could combine my interests in science and medicine and in history. And there's some real interdisciplinarity in these topics. And you think about, merging an interest in studying disease with, anyone that's interested in science, or anyone that's interested in historic preservation or in archaeology or in public history. I mean, the time is now and is ripe for folks to put these things together and make them relevant, because we're at a time now where COVID-19 has presented an enormous opportunity for us to reimagine the role of epidemics in our everyday lives.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason we did today's episode, so you can see the connection between all these things and how they come together in one massive subject or field of study. All of it connects together.
Absolutely. Well, that's good, man. I really appreciate you having me on today, and I really enjoyed our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. You got a few minutes to talk more about your book before we head out?
Yeah, sure. Yep, absolutely. So just the book just came out. It's called The Filth Disease. And this is a book that I've been working on for about 10 years. It's published with the University of Rochester Press. And this book is on the early history of epidemiology. And, epidemiology is something that everybody's talking about right now with COVID-19. How do we trace epidemics? How do scientists figure out who is sick? What are the routes of transmission of infectious disease? And that's a field of study, not just an academic discipline, but a public health science that began in the middle of the 19th century. And in this book, I trace how the earliest epidemiologists, first in Britain and then around the world, began using this probably one of the most important infectious diseases of that period, typhoid fever, in order to work out how to do this science, how to trace infectious diseases through communities, through looking at rural outbreaks, looking at urban outbreaks, looking at the global spread of disease. And what I show in this book, is that epidemiology has always been this public health science that tries to help us overcome infectious diseases and stop infectious diseases. And yet it's always, from its inception, also been a politicized science. So today, for example, we see, epidemiologists and public health officials like Anthony Fauci, who are these enormously politicized individuals, people that some people are just trying to throw under the bus and disregard, and other people are saying the epitome of sound science. And that's something that I show in my book that has always been a part of this field of epidemiology, that it's been hard for epidemiologists to communicate not just the science, but how that science applies to everyday people. So I look at both the development of the science and then also how that science worked to everyday people in their lives.
Well, this has been very educational. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this. And I want to thank you again for being here.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too.